Thank you guys so much for coming and braving the weather. My name is Amy. I'm the Public Programs Manager here at the museum. For upcoming programs, I encourage you to check out our programs calendar on our website and sign up for our newsletter. These are two upcoming programs that are art-related that I wanted to highlight. One that lets you explore the museum and sketch, and the second, a walking tour that discusses art installed along the 2nd Avenue subway. Also, you may have noticed when you walked in that we have a new exhibit. It's called The Subway Is ... and it celebrates the subway's 120th anniversary. Welcome you to come back and see it fully at the museum. We're open Wednesday through Sunday, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. One section looks at the subway's artwork in New York City, which collectively makes up one of the largest and most diverse collections of public art in the world. It's a collection that chronicles and reflects the many types of identities and communities that make New York City so wonderful, which is always worth celebrating and preserving, and why we are here today. So now I have the pleasure to introduce our panelists for this evening. Unfortunately, our original moderator for tonight, Achille Tomasino, was unable to join because of an illness. But fortunately, we have a wonderful stand-in with McClain Groff, who is a senior research associate at the Met and worked with Achille to mount Flight into Egypt, Black Artists in Ancient Egypt. If you haven't seen it, there's still some more time. It's on view for 10 more days through February 17th. McClain has also written about the MTA works in the exhibit for the Met's website and has held curatorial positions at the Whitney and Mass MoCA. Joining her will be Yaling Chen, who's one of the MTA Art Design's deputy directors, who became one of the directors in 2017 after serving for 12 years as curator and project manager. She oversees the permanent art project planning and strategic development with notable projects at the new Grand Central Madison, Penn Station, and Fulton Center. She also leads the digital art program and the photography lightbox program. Damien Davis is an artist and curator whose work recontextualizes cultural symbols to challenge identity and history. He has exhibited internationally, including at the Met, the Museum of Arts and Design, and the Whitney. He holds a master's degree in visual arts administration from NYU. Chloë Bass is a multiform conceptual artist working in performance, situation, conversation, publication, and installation. She has held numerous fellowships and residencies, and her work has appeared in many places such as Mass MoCA, Kunsthal Wilhelmshaven, the Brooklyn Museum, and elsewhere. She's an associate professor of art at Queens College and published the book Art and Social Action with Gregory Gillette in 2018. So please join me in welcoming the panelists and McClain.
Hi, everyone. My name is McClain. I'm a senior research associate at the Met, and I will do a brief presentation on Flight into Egypt, which is up at the Met until February 17th. Flight into Egypt is the first exhibition to broadly examine the nearly 150-year history of how modern Black artists and cultural figures asserted affinity with ancient Egypt, in opposition to the prevailing definition of 19th century Egyptology that distinguished ancient Egypt from Black Africa and instead characterized the civilization as Proto-European. The exhibition is accompanied by an informative and beautifully designed catalog, which, in addition to Achille's overview essay, includes essays by Met curator Andrea Achi on the history of Black Americans in the field of Egyptology, Oakland-based curator Makeda Best on Black photographers in Egypt, and Glenstone curator Mia Matthias on opacity and myth in the Black arts movement, in addition to statements by 10 artists featured in the exhibition. Here's an installation shot of the first gallery of the exhibition, which highlights the stories of 3 Black American artists, all expatriates to Europe, whose encounters with ancient Egyptian art impacted the trajectory of their careers. On On the left side of the screen is a newly commissioned work by Madeline Hunt Ehrlich called Cleopatra at the Mall. The subtitle of Flight into Egypt is Black Artists in Ancient Egypt, 1876 to Now. That 1876 start date refers to Black and Native American sculptor Ammonia Lewis's monumental marble sculpture, The Death of Cleopatra, which she executed from Rome in 1876, and which is considered the oldest surviving major work by a Black American artist with an ancient Egyptian subject. For conservation reasons, the Smithsonian was unable to lend the work to the Met, so we commissioned this film by Madeline to bring The Death of Cleopatra into the exhibition. The film traces the rediscovery of the once lost sculpture in the 1980s. And then I will also touch upon the second gallery in the exhibition, which is called Egyptology in the Color Line, which you can see on the right of your screen. It foregrounds Black scholarship and counter-narratives that emerged in defiance of the Eurocentric institutional and academic Egyptology that began in the late 1700s. This view is a look into the Awakening and Ascent Gallery, which celebrates the birth of Afrocentric visual art at the beginning of the 20th century, namely the Harlem Renaissance. The works in the Court Like Kings and Queens Gallery reflect the tremendous impact of pharaonic statuary and mural decoration on the figurative expression of Black artists from the 1940s to today. To the right of the doorway, you'll see Damien Davis's work on paper entitled Ancient Still Life. This section, entitled Heritage Studies, highlights modern and contemporary Egyptian artists' engagement with ancient Egypt and features works by Mahmoud Mokhtar and Mahmoud Said, the foundational sculptor and painter, respectively, of Egyptian modernism, who revived ancient motifs to promote a national self-image free from colonial interlopers. Contemporary Egyptian artists featured in this section engage in both transgressive and traditional forms of appropriation. The Pilgrimage and Fellowship section explores how people of the African diaspora have sought to bridge their distance from the continent through travel and within community. Photographs and video document some of the significant journeys of Black cultural figures to Egypt, which represent powerful acts of reclamation. Issues of The Crisis, a magazine founded in 1910 by W.E.B. Du Bois and other rare Black American publications, about 575, I believe, are accessible in a reading room and discussion space created by artists Stephanie Jemison and Jamal Cyrus, titled Alpha's Bet Is Not Over Yet, now in the Met's collection. In a first for the Met, the performance is an integral part of the exhibition in the form of a dedicated gallery. Organized in collaboration with Met Live Arts, the Performance Pyramid presents both a documentary history of Black performance art animated by ancient Egyptian themes and serves as the locus for live performances on select Fridays throughout the run of the exhibition. A New Song is a gallery immersed in light by Awal Eresku's disco bust of Nefertiti and featuring screened excerpts of music-related videos. From cover art to lyrical content, the 33 selected albums on view in the adjacent gallery trace a history from 1930s to present of Black musical engagement with ancient Egypt. The artworks in the final section, Space is the Place, meld ancient Egyptian myth, modern science, and science fiction. In the epic and influential 1974 film Space is the Place, artist, musician, and poet Sun Ra stars as a messianic extraterrestrial recruiting Black Americans to join a utopian space community inspired by the aesthetics of ancient Egypt. Sun Ra recognized and amplified the inherently cosmic characteristics of ancient Egyptian art in his creative visions, as have Julie Moretu, Fred Eversley, Renee Cox, and Ellen Gallagher, whose works are also featured in this gallery. Finally, the exhibition also includes site-specific works located outside the museum that are critical to the story of the ongoing reception of ancient Egypt within Black communities. For Flight into Egypt, the MTA has coordinated with the Met to highlight 3 public art installations inspired by ancient Egypt at subway and Metro North railroad stations. These polychrome bronze reliefs on the screen by Houston Conwell represent the first commission by the MTA to be installed in the subway in 1986. Collectively titled The Open Secret, they serve as monuments to the Harlem community of the 1980s. Created amid revitalization efforts above and below ground, The Open Secret symbolizes the historic preservation and public art movements that emerged in the wake of the prolonged urban decline of the 60s and 70s. Located within a 2-mile radius of this project, Marin Hassinger's Message from Malcolm, which you can see on your screen, and Terry Adkins' Harlem Encore, in which Harlem is similarly both site and subject, were unveiled in the following decade. While disparate in style and form, these 3 site-specific works all visualize claims to ancient Egypt, symbolizing continued kinship with this ancient African culture and signaling its resonance within the global diaspora. Thank you.
Hi. Thank you for coming. It's such a pleasure today to be in the company of McClain, Chloë, and Damien, and all of you. And tonight, and I also want to say that it's such a great occasion to have the entire arts and design here to be with me tonight, and the very near and dear colleague and friend who are here. So arts and design is a department that in the MTA that we provide a diverse range of visual and performance arts programs that contribute to the cultural vitality of the transit system in the region. Great. Our diverse range of our permanent art programs dedicates up to 1% of the eligible station construction budget to commission our work. It's the largest in the country with more than 400 commissioned artwork located at the subway and commuter rail stations, as well as MTA facilities. The work that we commissioned contribute to each station's special identity. They are meant to reflect something that of today's surrounding neighborhoods in a way that's much as the ceramic tiles that was put in by the subway founders to act as kind of wayfinding, also as embellishments in the early part of the last century. For the past 40 years, our work continued to be an important ingredient in an effort to humanize and improve our stations, and in a creative way to highlight the interdependence between the surrounding neighborhoods and the transit system. We also have a diverse range of temporary art programs that include the digital art program, posters, photography, lightbox exhibitions, music program, and the poetry motion collaborations. They are all very popular, and we've won many awards. We collaborate with museums and cultural groups on special events and projects, which always draw crowds. So, McClain set a great stage for me to take it further, and so tonight, I want to focus on the 3 public art installation that we commissioned in the early part of arts and design history. Those three installations, they are all located in Harlem, and they are included in the Met's exhibition as an off-site artwork. So I thought this is a good opportunity for those of you who have been to fly into Egypt. This could be an opportunity for you to extend your experience and knowledge from the museum exhibition. If you haven't been to the Met for Flight into Egypt, you should go. There are still 6 more days, and you can take this knowledge with you and have a kind of complete experience of the whole day. So the first one by Houston Conwell, it's called Open Secrets, that we installed in 1985. It was actually the very first artwork permanently placed in the subway station as a result of the kind of Present for Art component that was included in MTA's capital program since the founding of Arts and Design Office in 1985. Conwell was born in 1947 in Kentucky. He served in the U.S. Air Force from 1966 until 1970. And he did a tour of duty in Vietnam War. After the enlistment, he went on to study fine arts and received an BA from Howard University in DC, and also MFA from University of Southern California. So as he kind of shifted from painting into performance art, music, movement, and world relief and sculptural installation, he was always drawn to this idea of myth, ritual, and the transmission of wisdom and culture across continents and generations. His work largely embody a wide range of genre and forms, among them the maps or the earth, in order to depict the concept of memory, heritage, and African diaspora, and from there to reframe the identity of African American and how that inspired communication to remind us of our humanness. The Open Secret is a series of 4 bronze reliefs located on the mezzanine level at the 125th Street subway stations on the Lexington line. 2 of the triangular relief holds time capsule in the center of the sculpture. This is one of them here. It's sort of encased as secret ingredients that he obtained from Harlem in the 1980s, which in a way is a moment that was kept in time for the future generation. And also it resonates with the truth that would continue on to live across the boundary of time as well. In addition to Open Secret, he also made 2 other public artwork in Harlem that we should all look at them together in order to understand Conwell as an artist whose career work and how that really touched upon the deepest of the humanity. The other one here is called Joyful Mysteries. He made it in 1984, just 1 year before the Open Secrets. He works with the Studio Museum in Harlem to create these 7 bronze time capsules that contain confidential statements by 7 outstanding African Americans at the time of the 7 artists include Roma Bearden, and then the historians, the very first Black mayor, writers, and performers. So in August 1984, he buried this 7 time capsule in the museum's sculpture garden with the help of 10 school children from the boy choir in Harlem. The plan is to finally unearth this time capsule in September 2034, exactly 50 years after its burial. So some of us here in Arts and Design have mentioned that maybe we should do that in 2035. So we're gonna work on that. So coming back to Open Secrets, the other 2 triangle relief actually contains like forms and lines in compartments that is an invitation by Conwell for us to take on an exploration. In his word, the exploration might be of a place or into our own mind where we might find eternal secrets that are saved and put in time capsule for our children and for a generation to come. The third artwork for public space that he made is for the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. This work is titled River. It was inspired by Langston Hughes' poem, The Negro Speaks of Rivers. This piece is a large monumental terrazzo floor taking the form of a cosmogram with interconnected trail of river representing the Harlem Renaissance and its myriad of connections of the past, present, and into the future. This work collectively presents many of Conwell's lasting artistic practice and concerns, including community, history, and the creation of sacred spaces, and the involvement of a community of people in the idea of doing a public art. It doesn't always happen one person alone. It involves a group of people. So therefore, it's really appropriate to me that to look at in the perspective that it's a community of people in bearing witness to that process, and because of that, making it complete. Therefore, altogether, they relate to African American experience and the quest for equality. Maren Hassinger was born also in 1947. She grew up in Los Angeles, and she studied dance when she was 5 years old. Later on, she went on to have a background in sculpture and fiber arts. However, this idea of movements would always remain a kind of integral approach to her practice in sculptural form. She has long been interested in nature and its relationship to industry. Working alongside artists like Senegal and Goody, David Hammonds, and Hosnan Conwell, her non-wire rope sculpture brings together industrial and natural materials to articulate the relationship between humanity and the environment. Here, this object called Rivers that she made and currently is in the collection of Studio Museum in Harlem, kind of provide a really nice example of Messenger's work. The artwork flow like a waterway, but it appears to be pretty heavy. The title and the material evoke the chain and ropes of the Middle Passage, indicating the voyage of the enslaved Africans across the Atlantic to Americas. It's also a tribute to nature that Hassinger considers a mean to unify humanity. She approached her project at Central Park North by weaving a variety of themes, including quotes from Malcolm X's speeches and symbols of powers to convey the idea of power, leadership, and spiritual support. The letters from Malcolm X's speeches were inscribed in black, blue, and gold mosaic on the stairway entrance at the station and leading down to the upright mosaic wall on the platform level in a style that evoked the Islamic Kufic script often seen in the Quran. The symbolic ideograms along the mosaic frieze are based on themes that are African and African American in origin, and they together symbolize unity, love, speech, meeting, and courage. On the opposite side of the mosaic wall, Islamic decorative design styles and the preponderance of blue all together to convey a celestial canopy, which is meant to suggest a spiritual space. It also kind of altogether collectively respond to the color and design of the station's original carpet mosaic. Message from Malcolm by Martin Hassinger conceptually connect with Hassinger's the body of sculptural works. You know, memories and experiences resonate. Words and history alike bear volume and weight as well. It's a reminder of the truth and a belief that African Americans have the power to determine the destiny of their own. Last award I want to share tonight is by Terry Atkins for Metro North Harlem 125th Street Station. Atkins was born in 1953. He was known for his boundary blurring career work. He bridged the realm of music and sculpture by creating works that are both monumental and functional. His work for Metro North Park Avenue Viaduct project in 1999 is a pair of double-layered silhouette reliefs that intend to embody the past, present, and the hopeful future of Harlem. Each silhouetted panels measure approximately around 6 feet tall, 60 feet wide, and 18 inches deep. Together, they occupy around 720 square feet. For Atkins, the relief would be made in laser-cut aluminum, which then sandblasted to provide a shimmering daytime presence. At night, the silhouette would be backlit by hidden blue neon tubing, creating a radiant glow around the form, while also setting them apart from the neon advertisement that kind of enveloped 125th Street corridor. So you can see this is one of the stylized Sphinx in fabrication. The Sphinx is what he considered as a keystone to each panel on both ends. It was appropriated by Atkins from the work of Aaron Douglas in 1926. So here you see the cover of Fire magazine, which is also in the Met's exhibition. You can actually go there and see the real thing itself. This was a quarterly literary magazine devoted to the younger Black artists and the culture. This is the first and only issue that was published in 1926 during Harlem Renaissance by artists like Wallace Truman, Aaron Douglas, and Langston Hughes. The two image here showing the west on the top and east on the bottom elevation of the installed Harlem Encore on the viaduct. You can see the keystone, the Sphinx keystone on both ends, flanking the panel. In the center, three ancestral images speak to the common African diaspora of all Harlem residents, and setting the stage for a sense of noble anonymity, speaking for men and women, and the commonality of all humankind. On the front layer, between the Sphinx and the ancestral figures, there's those like jagged edges on the west elevation on the top that harken to African past, while the rounded contours on the east elevation on the bottom symbolize the acculturation of the present. On the back panel, radial images unfold kind of symmetrically from the center outward towards the Sphinx to symbolize the spiritual nature with a kind of beam-like aura. There's also the directional rays behind the Sphinx that are like moving inward to indicate the rising and setting of the sun from east to west. So to achieve a radiant glow at night, as Aken had originally envisioned, the materials was the design, with the help of the engineer and lighting designers, the large neon fluorescent tubing was put in for the larger area with high density discharge for the smaller areas, yielding to a level of intensity that would be necessary for a kind of indirect lighting application at night. However, in less than a month when those spats were put in, 12 of them stopped working. So in 2019, Arts and Design collaborated with Metro North to upgrade and relight Harlem Encore with LED uplights for the larger area and augmented with the floodlight from the sides. So now, if you take a walk or happen to be upon by Harlem Encore at nighttime, you'll be able to see the glory of the piece brought back to life in the glow of soft blue at nighttime. So that's my part, and I want to share. You'll be able to get on Bloomberg Connect and to really use the map to experience or learn more about our 40 commissioned artwork throughout the entire MTA region. Thank you so much.
Hi everyone, can you hear me? Oh, it's good. I don't have to awkwardly adjust the microphone. Well, let me just start with a place of gratitude. Thanks to the New York Transit Museum, MTA Arts, and the Met, just for everything, really. It's also really just nice to see so many friends in the room. My name is Damien Davis. I'm one of the artists in the Flight into Egypt exhibition. I am also an artist who has a public art commission with the MTA. This piece, called Empirical Evidence, is located on the 3rd Avenue Bridge in Mount Vernon, New York. One of the things that I thought was really good about what you were saying, Yaling, was this idea of community having a sense of place, but then also feeling grounded or having a sense of self in the place that you live, which I think is indicative of this specific project, but then also the Met exhibition in some. Just to give a little bit of context or background on my practice, I'm really interested in language, specifically the ways in which language kind of fails us or falls short, the way in which it's messy, it's clumsy, and I like to explore that largely through deployment of this loosely fixed lexicon of shapes that I've been developing for myself over time. I tend to think of them, or I often refer to them as prisms, in the sense that I'm importing all of this meaning or research or history into a shape, but I'm not necessarily reliant on the viewer to pull those specific meanings or histories through their interpretation. The hope is to always make work that feels discursive in some way, shape, or form, something that allows people to build conversations around the work. And it's also just kind of born out of being a person who exists in this kind of body, who has chosen to navigate the art world. So, and what I mean when I say that is like, what does it mean to go to art school, like get all the training, learn all the things, but still maybe treat it as foreign or other when you walk into traditional exhibition spaces like galleries, museums, things like that. So for me, my practice is always geared towards making work that calls people in, that allows people to feel like they can start building conversations around something that they're looking at, and then whether or not you have formal training in art history, art education, etc., you can just have conversations about art. So this is the piece in the show, still kind of surreal. It's called Ancient Still Life, which is one of the earlier pieces in part of this exploration of shapes and iconography and lexicon and language, etc. So it's almost all of the sort of first wave of shapes that I developed for this ongoing project. And something that I haven't shared with a lot of people, but I guess I will share now. All of the colors used in this print are pulled directly from Adobe Illustrator's set palette titled Ancient. So the palette is literally like technology's idea of what something ancient is supposed to look like. So then it's about like assigning these very specific colors, these ochres, these reds, onto objects that hopefully are charged with either some kind of historical meaning, some discursive meaning, things like that. Here's the piece on the wall next to, it's like crazy to say, here's me next to Kara Walker. Like, the fuck? But one of the things I will say is I remember, how many of you got a chance to see this Kara Walker piece in person? Just like really heroic, amazing, impressive. I remember going to see that piece, and the thing that I found more compelling or more interesting than the piece itself was the conversations that were happening around it. And for those of you that might have gone to see it in person, you may remember people posing for pictures and doing really vulgar things to this figure's body, to the image, maybe kind of losing all sense or grounding in what the conversation was really supposed to be about, which is the way in which like Black women have been sort of undervalued or devalued or commodified, commercialized, over-sexualized in ways that are out of their control. So seeing that play out in real time around this piece was really kind of like an eye-opener for me, and that in a lot of ways informed this strategy of making work, which was more about the piece being completed by the conversations that happen around the piece versus me trying to put forth any kind of specific narrative with the work that I'm making. To bring it back to kind of like public art stuff, I've been doing public art or public-facing work for a while now. These are some pieces from the Broadway Windows, which is a gallery space on Broadway and 11th Street, if I'm remembering correctly. I love storytelling. I love using histories, especially histories that have been smudged or erased, particularly as they relate to like Black women specifically. So I won't go like too much into detail, but these pieces were all inspired by interviews and narratives from my mother, who had to serve as the primary advocate for my older brother who lived with sickle cell. He died, God, like 15 years ago now. So she was the one who would have to advocate to the doctors and the nurses who oftentimes would give my brother like subpar care. But then also filtering it through the lens of myself, who was the quote-unquote healthy kid, sitting in the hospital waiting room for hours on end playing with the toys. So it's about kind of reconciling those really horrific narratives that she was telling me with the objects and the symbols and the shapes and the toys that I typically associated from that time. Thinking more specifically about transit and art, or my relationship to transit and art, these three pieces were all made during a residency that I did in Chile in January of 2020. So for those of you that may or may not be familiar, do people know about the political climate in Chile? It's random things on your Jeopardy board. So just for like quick context, the people of Chile were uprising against the government largely because of an expired constitution, but the on-the-ground protests were sparked by an increase in fare hikes. That might sound familiar to you New Yorkers. So I came into Chile after all these protests had kind of decimated a lot of the public-facing sculptures, monuments, things like that, but before there had been any kind of real sort of political resolution to the things that were happening on the ground. So thinking about the average person's relationship to public transit, their reliance on that, not just for community building, but just for getting from point A to point B, and how those modes of transportation form like a very critical kind of like cultural artery for cities and for communities and for people. Right after or before, around this time, was also when the commission for the MTA project had happened. I was told that my project was like actually a really quick one. Was it quick? Yeah, you, or I think it took about like 2 years to produce this, which from what I was told is a relatively quick turnaround. Tara, you were the one to take me up to Mount Vernon for the first time to look at the site before we knew where the work was going to be, or if I was even going to get this project. So for those of you that are unfamiliar, the MTA will do open calls and artists are allowed to submit images of their work. And even if you don't get that particular commission that you were applying for, the MTA keeps your work on file and sometimes reaches out to you if they think that, you know, the project that they're searching for and your work is in alignment in some kind of way, shape, or form. I remember missing the preliminary meeting and then doing a makeup meeting with you, Tara, and we were on the Metro North heading up to see this, and I asked you, it's like, out of curiosity, who else is up for this opportunity? And you started listing off the names, and I was like, we can just turn around and go home right now. There's no way I'm getting this against these people. But the kind of beautiful thing that I think happened because of that is because I didn't think I was going to get the opportunity, I wasn't necessarily concerned or worried about making something that was going to appeal to these imaginary people in my head. I was like, I'm just going to collect my little fee for submitting an idea, and I'm just going to give you like the blackest thing I can come up with, which at the time was a scary thing for me to do because I had been a finalist for other public art commissions in the past, and I've had people literally tell me, or after presenting the proposal, say to me, is there any way you would be interested in making something a little less black? Yeah, that happened like multiple times, interestingly, for things in this borough. So the idea of being able to make work that felt authentically from my own voice was something that was just like kind of scary for me to do at the time. What's interesting is that similar to Harlem, Mount Vernon is a historically black community, black town. So what I thought was going to be an unwinnable application kind of backfired, in the sense that the people on the selection committee for this particular town understood what I was trying to do, which was make a piece titled Empirical Evidence, which thinks in a lot of ways about how Black people and Black bodies are perceived, the ways in which we associate objects or cultural signifiers with Blackness, but also just like a pure opportunity to create something on a bridge that's discursive enough for people to stop and just have conversations around. So there's like a really pretty picture of the train with the piece. Some context or history about Mount Vernon. You'll notice this red line in the map below. The locals in Mount Vernon refer to it as the Cut. When I wouldn't necessarily call it a tunnel, but the sort of throughway that was built for the Metro North was built at a time when the intention was to create a sort of transit corridor that allowed like poorer Black, brown people to quickly commute into the city to serve as like workers, servants, etc. The bridges over the course of those several decades had fallen to such disrepair that they had to shut down all of the bridges across that line for a decade. So the people living on the southern side of the Cut, which is predominantly Black and brown, were largely cut off from being able to commute to the northern side of Mount Vernon, which was more affluent, more white, etc. So what you're seeing here is the ribbon cutting for the bridge, and for the first time in a decade, a fire truck being able to actually cross the street instead of having to circle all the way around. So even just the ability to like respond to trauma, to fires, things like that, just being able to sort of help living people was a thing that wasn't necessarily facilitated at the time. So I guess this is like the justification for me being here, the Nefertiti shape. One of the other things that I will say, and I haven't really talked about this publicly either, just thinking about the artist's role in working with the public, making something that's hopefully generous and responsive enough to the communities that exist there. There was like some pushback on this, and there was someone who sent me an anonymous email saying how shameful and embarrassing of a project this was, because he didn't like that there were two women who looked like they were about to kiss. Gay shit. You know, or maybe some of the other shapes being charged in ways that potentially made them uncomfortable. And the MTA was really amazing at working with us, and I was really like spooked about this whole situation. I was like, we need to have a conversation. What if they come to the ribbon cutting and try to make a scene? Like, I don't know what's going to happen. Nothing wound up actually happening. But it is interesting in the sense that, and I think Chloe's going to talk more about this when she comes up, like, what responsibility do you as an artist have to the community that you're placing the work in, especially work that's going to be sitting for, you know, this will be around long after I'm gone. Is the primary responsibility to yourself as an artist? Is the primary responsibility to a public, or is it somewhere situated in the middle of that? Like, who actually are we trying to serve when we're making these things? How much does, like, or how much do you allow for kind of just like pure classic artist narcissism to sort of find its way into these works? And how much of it is about hopefully creating opportunities for people to see themselves, especially in historically Black communities, because the thing that I've noticed just from doing these types of projects or being put in positions to potentially do these kinds of projects is like that is a thing that is still like under siege, under threat. Like anti-Blackness is still a thing that we see and experience all the time around the world, and it's something that's also, I think, affected the Flight into Egypt exhibition in a lot of ways as well. But yeah, I think there might be space for specific questions, but yeah, I made a bridge that hopefully does more than just show art, but hopefully also bridges people and concepts and multiple things. So, thank you.
Hi, my name is Chloë Bass, and I'm a person. I'm a person who forgot to make a cover slide for a presentation, so you launch right into the content, but that'll hopefully keep things moving. So in 2019, I was invited by the studio, actually in 2018, technically, I was invited, but in 2019 executed a project commissioned by the Studio Museum in Harlem called Wayfinding. And this was a project that was put on as part of their In Harlem series, which has been happening in Harlem's parks, primarily Marcus Garvey Park and St. Nicholas Park, although also occasionally in other places, since I believe around 2014 or 15 is when that program started, and has been particularly robust in the time period where the Studio Museum's building has been closed, as they prepare for a new building that will open this year, 2025. I was invited to do this project very much as a surprise to me. I am an artist who traditionally has done a lot of work around the idea of public space, public culture, public institutions, public education, and public ways of being. But I was not actually an artist who had ever made a physical project that existed over a long time in public space. So being invited to do this was shocking. It asked me to think in ways both materially and conceptually that were in line with some of my ways of being as a person who has been born, raised, and still lives in New York City, but was actually very, very different from the ways that I have of working and thinking up until that point as an artist. And so I thought that for this presentation, this would be a good hinge point, because we're really moving from the works at the Met and through MTA Arts and Design that are situated in Harlem, talking about your own experiences with Harlem and the Studio Museum, and then kind of traveling up to Mount Vernon. And here I am returning it to Harlem as a kind of heart of many stories, which is something that we know and something that we feel, but actually has brought us all together, I think, in a very particular way related to place, culture, and history. So Wayfinding is, or was at that time, a series of 24 signs. They're sculptures, really, that existed in public space at 3 different scales. It is now a series of 48 signs that exist in public in 3 different scales. And I can tell you a little bit about where the project has gone and how that came to be. But first, to introduce you to the way the work works. So you see here a sign that is a 10-foot by 4-foot billboard, and the legs are holding that sign face about 7 feet off the ground. So just to give you a sense of scale, that is a mirrored billboard face with frosted letters on it spelling out the question, how much of love is attention? Originally, the project was centered around 3 questions. How much of love is attention? How much of care is patience? And how much of life is coping? Which held together kind of the major framework for the large-scale works, but also opened a conversation into other types of topics through that very direct linguistic act, right? How do we start a conversation? Oftentimes we ask a question. There were also very small signs. So the sign that you see here is 5 inches by 8 inches. It is the exact same material as the standard botanical garden marker that you have seen in the Brooklyn Botanic Garden or New York Botanic Garden or botanical gardens all over the country and the world. These small signs were nestled throughout the landscape and contained individual pieces of personal narrative, either drawn from my own life, drawn from the lives of friends, or fictionalized. You don't really know where this language is coming from, but it is positioned in a way that leads to discovery and contemplation, and hopefully an anchor that draws you more strongly into a story. So for anyone who can't read this one, it says, "The unparalleled mix of emotions when someone who loves you calls to say, 'Rest.' I see what you're doing and the world needs you to be well. Joy, sorrow, and a relief so profound it's almost bitter." Oops. I thought that I had the third scale assigned next in the presentation, but I don't, but you're gonna see it later. And I remember why you're gonna see it later, and it's because at that point I need to talk about hands. So wayfinding invited me to consider, right, what is the scale of the monumental and what kind of monument do I want to produce at a time when our conversations around monuments, narratives, and depictions of history have really been shifting. And I think that a lot of that shift has been positive, but what it has not really accommodated for me is a sense of the abstract. So I knew that I had to, given the circumstances, make something at least from a size perspective that had a relationship to monumentality. And what I chose to do with that invitation was to reflect the community back to itself, right? A mere billboard reflects its circumstances. It reflects the weather. It reflects the buildings. It actually doesn't reflect the people who are there because I made it a little bit too high to do that on purpose. I did not want it to become a selfie station, but I wanted it to offer back whatever it is that is in the world around you, because it's oftentimes through acts of artistic practice that we really come to recognize what we already knew. And that's what this project is for me, and that's what I hope it has been for other people. So because I did this project, a funny thing happened. And now I'm going to talk about a totally different project and come back to wayfinding. In this presentation, I will now only discuss public works that I've made, which is something that I never anticipated happening in my life. But once you make one at a time when all other museums are closed, because wayfinding opened in September of 2019 and remained on view until September of 2020. And from March of 2020 through September of 2020, there were no museums, right? So a lot of people saw the work in a context where I think they were seeking safe ways of being outside, solace, aesthetic experience, a respite from whatever it is that they were going through inside in isolation. I was very lucky that the themes of the project actually worked within a pandemic that none of us could anticipate and the ways that our lives changed. But because of that, I was then asked to make a series of projects for other parks, which asked me to really deal with language and image and form in new ways. My favorite thing to do is to do something for the first time. So wayfinding was my first project in public space. This is a project that was commissioned by the Henry Art Gallery in Seattle, Washington for Volunteer Park, which is an Olmsted Park in the Capitol Hill neighborhood in Seattle. And for this project, because Seattle is surrounded by mountains, which is something that you probably know, but I did not know because I had not really been to Seattle until I did this project. And every time I turned around, there was like a massive mountain sneaking out of the sky, and I found it really funny. I don't know why. Like, there was something in me, a person who has not been raised around mountains, that I was like, this is hilarious. There are massive, gigantic mountains just like sneaking up on me. The clouds would part and there would be a mountain, right, somewhere in the distance. And so thinking about that relationship of stone to landscape, I decided to make a stone project for Volunteer Park. So this is also a project that combines language and image, but in a very different way. The project is made up of 16 stone benches that, yes, you can sit on, yes, you can climb on, and a very rude man, while we were installing the work, said, well, what if my dog pees on it? And I was like, what if your dog does pee on it? And his dog was like, I'm not here for this. I'm not peeing on your work. But yes, your dog can pee on it, because things that exist in public space have a public life, as do we all. And this was a way to think differently about body and scale. I really like giving people the contemplation space that I believe that we deserve as part of our interior landscape, especially in public, actually. As a New Yorker, I'm used to thinking of myself as a person with 8 million neighbors. And actually, right before this panel, I've been here before, but usually with a child. So it's like not the best time for me to read and learn. So I don't have a child here with me tonight, and so I got to read and learn for the first time in the Transit Museum. And what I was reading and learning was the timeline that is on the wall. You see it kind of in that back corner, but like it extends quite a ways that way. And what I was looking specifically at was the population statistics. And what I learned is that basically between like the 1880s and the 1940s, New York's population increased by about 5 million people, which is really crazy. And certainly, like when you think about how the city continues to try to catch up with issues of population with respect to transit and housing and other forms of public equity, right? You see that growth pattern and you're like, wow, no wonder we are struggling, because that is an off the charts amount of growth. Now, the amount of growth between the 1940s and now has not been that astronomic, right? But still, I think the impression of what a city can be is really impacted by the people who are in it. So this project is giving a physical contemplation space in a way that wayfinding was offering maybe the emotional or mental contemplation space. And each sculpture, this is just a close-up from the previous image, has two things on it. One is an engraved text. This one says, I can't actually totally read it, but the controlled archive of something living, formerly wild. And then also at the top, you see a kind of image. That's actually an engraved silhouette of a plant. And what it's coated in is the reflective beads that you see when you cross the street that make the white lines in the crosswalk shimmer. That is actually like a very fine glass beading powder. So in this case, it's mixed with paint and glue and applied to the stone. But what that means if you're in the park, and depending on the weather and the time of day, when you move around the work, the image portion appears to kind of shimmer and capture the light and move with you, which I found very exciting. The plant silhouettes were drawn from three sources. So one is a plant that was in the park before it was a park, so a plant that was actually native to the environment and the region. One is a plant that was introduced to the park through Olmsted's design and control. And one is a plant that actually is likely to become a major portion of the park because of climate change, so various forms of invasive species that will become part of a landscape that has not yet reached us. So the project is also really pointing to the nature of the past, present, and future through plant life and growth. So now I'm showing the other picture from wayfinding. So one of the other things that captivates me about working at the human scale and in a public environment is the idea of human bodies themselves. It's interesting that Maren Hassinger's work has come up tonight. So Maren also made a project as part of the Studio Museums in Harlem series. And I didn't know until you just taught me that Maren's original training was in dance. My original training is in theater. I will go to art school later. And in thinking about things from a theatrical perspective, thinking about the ways that bodies move through space and use space allows each project to become a choreography of objects. And also, I am quite literally interested in gestural depictions of human bodies as images, right? It is that basic. So for many years, I have been captivated by specifically hands and the communicative gestures of hands between people. And I work a lot with found images from the New York Public Library's media collection. If you've never been there, it's in the central branch of the library. It's like totally magical. You can go and look up pictures by theme. The theme folders are sometimes really bad and confusing in a really nice way. But if you are not a patient person, it is not the place for you. But if you are a patient person, you will be deeply rewarded with a trove of like archival images with very little background source material that you can check out up to 60 pictures at a time and take them home in a large green folder and think about them. So as part of a totally different project that I'm not going to talk about tonight, I went through every single image in the folders marked families from 1920 to 2000. Yes, I've looked at every single one, except maybe the ones that were like checked out at the time that I didn't know. That is over 10,000 pictures. And I was looking for something specific that I don't need to get into today. But out of that search, I came away with a collection of 47 images that I have been studying very deeply and scanning and using in different formats of my work. So in wayfinding, they appear as an image-based sign. When there were 24 signs, 3 of them were image-based signs. Now that there are 48 signs, 6 of them are image-based signs, each showing a familial gesture of holding without any context of the face, so just the bodies and the gestures between people. These images have also been used in a public billboard form. So this is a billboard that I was invited to make for the city of Minneapolis in 2020, which was obviously because of George Floyd, a very complicated time to make a billboard for the city of Minneapolis. And I really love this image so much. It's actually, you can't see it, but it's a grandfather and his two granddaughters riding a horse, but you just see them holding each other as they sit together on the horse. And the text of this project is, like most realities, this time will turn out both better and worse than its myth. So it was out of that interest in hands, that interest in bodies, that interest in language that my project for the MTA came together, which is the last thing that I'm going to talk about tonight, and then we're all going to talk together a bit. So Damien, you brought up this idea of like, what is it that we can expect from the public? What is it that we can ask of the public? And also, what is it that the public asks of us? So you also mentioned this in passing, but I'm going to say it out loud. When you sign a contract with MTA Art and Design, you are committing to make a work that lives longer than you. You have to think about your own death, which is really intense. Like, it's the scariest contract I ever signed because none of my other contracts made me think about mortality. They just made me think about law. And I am fine with the contract. A contract is a story and an agreement and a legal document and whatever. I sign tons of them all the time, but none of them make me think about my death. So this project was commissioned for the Lorimer Street L and G station. It's on the Lorimer Street L end of the station. I guess it was technically also a quick project, is what I've learned. Because I talked with Tara and Yaling in 2021, and actually it was all in there in 2023, but we say that it opened in 2024 because of construction timelines. So this is a mosaic project that also deals with my interest in hands and bodies and language. It uses not the archival images that I was drawing from in my 47 images of obsession, which I can talk to you about for like 16 hours, but actually 3 new images from the picture collection that were taken in the area of the Lorimer Street subway station. So this image is an image of 2 men walking down the street in the 1960s. They're actually Orthodox Jewish men. You can't necessarily tell, but then when I tell you, you can kind of tell. They still wear the same coats, right? Carrying a ring of keys. And this project is spread out over 3 walls of the station, but it actually only carries 1 sentence, which you'll see a phrase at a time. So it begins, "Whenever I'm pulled under by the weight of all I miss." Then there's a middle panel, which has a photograph of teenagers at a house party on the south side of Williamsburg. They're all holding each other, so you can see their hands and bodies and clothing holding each other. And the middle phrase says, "I take some consolation that I have known." And the final image is 2 guys talking outside of a bagel shop in like the late 2000s, 2006, 2007. And the last phrase says, "and may yet know another life." So whenever I'm pulled under by the weight of all I miss, I take some consolation that I have known and may yet know another life. And it's this language that I'm putting into space, right, that asks me to consider what will work for people, what will be of weight and meaning to people far into the future. I think that aesthetically, there is so much turnover between what we see visually that appears fresh and then appears of a time and then appears like cheesy and dated and then again feels like ahead of its time, right? Like aesthetics go through cycles. We know this through fashion. We know it through music. We know it through naming, the way that we name our babies, right? We know it in all these different ways. And language goes through cycles as well. But you need to be thinking towards a future that at this point especially feels so unpredictable, right? And beyond the bounds of what we can know, and yet offers a space for people to continue to come together. So when I'm thinking about what can I expect of a public and what can a public expect for me, I'm trying to continuously engage with this as a scope of conversation that doesn't necessarily need to be completed. Even if a work is finished and a site is permanent as anything is in this world, and will have a life that has nothing to do with me. People send me images of this work. People have made altars on the work in Seattle. So oftentimes when the museum does a condition report on the project monthly, which is very nice of them, it's a lot of work. And oftentimes when they go to do that condition report, they will find collections of flowers and small toys and notes placed on the stones of the project, almost as if people are demarcating a grave site, which is really amazing for me. A way of kind of commemorating even moments of history as we lose them and want to hold on to them, right? In addition to the way that we commemorate an entire life. People sent me images of wayfinding in the background of their children's birthday parties, with birthday party balloons tied to the sign work frames. And, many other examples of the ways that these things are of me, but are beyond me. And I think that is at the key of sort of how we shape history and visual culture through projects that are conversation. Understanding that what we expect is kind of what we would want to expect out of people, and that art isn't different from that, but maybe in its best moments, it can give us back to ourselves. Thank you.
So we're going to give our speakers just a chance to get seated, and we'll have a very short conversation and then can open up the questions to the audience.
Thank you. Are these on? You can hear me?
I think they're hot.
Okay,
Yes.
they're hot. Okay, where should we start? Those were amazing presentations. Thank you guys for that. I think the first thing I would love for you to, Chloe and Damien, to speak about is, let's see, I think site responsiveness and materiality. How did you land on the materials that you did? Why? And also design. We were speaking beforehand about some of the developments that you had to make because of the location on the bridge. So I'd be curious to hear.
Yeah. So one of the things that was really nice about my commission is that I didn't really have to change my process that much. So my work is largely either digital prints or laser cut acrylic held with hardware. So the amazing thing about this project is I was able to kind of make the piece the way that I would normally make the piece in my own studio, and unfortunately had to send it off to a fabricator. I'm curious if the same kinds of logistical concerns came up for you, but one of the things that I had to do for my commission is we had to have an engineer scan the files to see how much negative space existed on each of the individual panels in order to make sure that there was enough wind passing through to prevent it from falling over onto the train tracks below, which would be a problem. The other thing that I was going to say, and just in terms of comparing our situations, is you get to, in my opinion, enjoy having a piece that facilitates kind of quiet contemplation in a space that's very much not quiet, versus mine where almost every time you're encountering the piece, you're moving in some way. You're either in a car crossing the bridge, you're a person who's physically trying to cross the bridge to go home, or you're on the Metro North, riding underneath the bridge. So it did impact some of the things that I had to do in terms of scale and legibility, making sure that the piece was legible from a distance, from up close, all those kinds of things.
Yeah, that reminds me of Terry Adkins' piece more so than the two previous that I spoke about, Marin Hassinger's and Houston Conwell's, which were embedded within the subway system where you're moving through and the mezzanine or waiting for the train versus a bridge like Houston,
Moving.
a distance and thinking about scale.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a quiet person in a loud place. So, like, everything that I do is kind of like a quiet thing in a loud place. And that's just the way that I am. So that's also the way that I move through the world and think about making things. But I will say I did not have to take into account the possibility of wind with my MTA commission. But I did have to take it into account with wayfinding. So actually, wayfinding is materially and engineering rated to live through a hurricane, and that was tested because it did live through a hurricane. There was a hurricane the first summer when it was on view in Harlem, and the day after, a whole bunch of people had messaged me on Instagram, and they were like, how much of love is attention sign? It like sheared off, but we saved it. It's like down there. Like people were like, we love it. We saved it. We don't know what to do. Like how do we reach the museum? We could only find you. Like I was like, okay, I got it. So I've thought about it in other contexts, but that project has lived through a hurricane. In St. Louis, when it was at the Pulitzer Arts Foundation, it lived through 2 tornadoes. In Los Angeles, it just got very hot, so it can be very hot. And now it has found a permanent home in Buffalo at the formerly known as the Albright Knox, now Buffalo AKG Museum, where it has gotten very cold. So it can do all of those things without harming or burning a person. Because if you have things that are metal at person level that could be touched, cities and art institutions do not want the liability of burns, I understand. And also the parts that appear to be glass are plexi, because glass in public space can be challenging in terms of people potentially breaking and damaging. I did not show you, but could have shown you a glass project that I actually made for the California African American Museum in Los Angeles, which was like a whole heap of liability concerns. But I think for me, materially, because I do not have a training in material production practice, everything that I make is actually like made up, right? Like I make it up in my imagination and then I produce it in Adobe Illustrator, which is not material. And then I send it to people and I'm like, we're gonna make that. And they're like, what is that? And then I have a lot of conversations because that's what I'm good at. I'm good at talking to people and working through problems collaboratively. So I've been working with fabricators consistently throughout my process, so I didn't have to change very much. But I will say what was so amazing about doing the work in Mosaic with Stephen Mioto, who is like a genius and a national treasure, who also rides a motorcycle and will give you chocolate. He's amazing. He's, 68 and has been working in Mosaic since he was 16, right? It's his whole life. And so working with him and his team of people to translate another one of my like fake Adobe Illustrator ideas into something that's very small and meticulous in this way allowed me the space to interrupt a material process at like a very fine point level that was new to me. Certainly is different than when I'm thinking about it in large pieces of metal or like literally 16 tons of stone in Seattle.
I can ask another question.
Sure.
Have both of you briefly mentioned audience response, but I'm curious to hear more about what it's been like since these pieces have been up in public. Are you aware, or Yaling?
I'll go first. I think from my commission, it's been mostly positive, with the exception of, again, like some weird message I got right before we had the ribbon cutting. I feel very fortunate to have the piece in Mount Vernon specifically, mostly because of the history of that community. So even when I've gone back, because I've got some friends that live in the town, every time I've interacted with someone and they've mentioned that piece, it's been good. I'm sorry, I guess I'm just kind of thinking about what it means to, like, I'm trying to work through that question in my head, and the thing that keeps popping up is like, what would happen if everyone hated it? I don't really know, and I'm curious if there's been situations with the MTA where, actually, I can think of a specific piece. It's pink.
Not yours, I have
Not mine.
another.
But yeah, we might be talking about the same thing. But thinking about instances where the public just doesn't jive or resonate with the piece, which can happen for a number of reasons, right? It can be because the subject matter doesn't speak to them specifically or directly enough, or it might feel too specific and direct for a community that they don't like, which is maybe something that I've experienced, but it almost always happens before there's even an opportunity to see the work like enter the public space. I think this idea of anti-Blackness is pervasive, especially in the art world, and it's something that doesn't get talked about enough or called out in the moments when it's happening. So this particular project with the MTA in a lot of ways feels like an outlier or something different or separate or just flat out better than a lot of my other experiences, like trying to navigate the public art world.
Yeah, I have a lot of stories about audience responses, including the public, even colleagues from the MTA. I remember on the slide, Damien, you showed the opening events. I was there with Tara and Damien, and the mayor was there. It was a day of other celebration from the entire city, because they experienced this cultural, economic, and social divides for so many years because of the cuts in literal sense. And then because of MTA was able to rebuild the bridge with artwork by Damien and 3 other artists that really has mended the division. That means so much for them because finally they can actually walk across the bridge, carry their laundry, their grocery, just go home. They don't have to make their way around it. And so that's why this Mount Vernon project, including your work, is so meaningful that we actually heard a lot. We got a lot of appreciation from the city officials, from the residents. And I also remember when we were at the installation of Chloe's project, people actually went on their way rushing to the train, to the subway, or out to the stairs. They noticed it, they spotted, they stopped, they reached their hand out, they touched the wall. And then they pause and think for a few seconds before they move on. And those are the moments that when you witness, you understand your work, my work, does have meanings and have impacts. And I think my colleague here would agree with me. Internally at the MTA, when we were preparing for the press events, and my colleague was working on the remarks for one of the presidents, and she told me, oh my God, that literally has become her favorite piece, Chloe's project. Yeah, so I have a lot more to share, but I'm gonna stop here.
I just learned something I didn't know, so I'm a little startled. But yeah, I mean, with this particular project, I would say the feedback that I have received has been overwhelmingly positive. And there are questions that people have, but I think that questions are a form of engagement, and nothing is going to be perfect, so I don't mind that either, right? One question is like, why is all your work in English? Which is a very good question. And it's because I speak English, but like that doesn't mean that it is better. So there has to be ways of negotiating that as well, right? Which is something that I know, but also is something that I'm happy to discuss. With some other projects, I've had different levels of public feedback. I will say what made me the happiest was the neighborhood of Harlem, or the St. Nicholas Park neighborhood of Harlem residents' response to wayfinding, which is that they felt incredibly protective of it. And anytime anything went wrong, we would hear from so many people. It wasn't just for the hurricane. That was like the most dramatic example. But really, people felt like a desire to tend for the work, and that to me was even more meaningful than the idea that they like it. Because, you know, when we have a public, abstractly, but also literally, that is something that we make together. And a lot of it feels dictated by design and circumstance and government and all these other things, but we do continue to have the ability to intervene into these spaces in ways that sometimes I think we're aware of and sometimes I think we forget. And so the relationship between these works and acts of tending, that's what kind of shows me like the highest level of regard.
Should we open it up to questions now?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. I think we have time for a couple. If you can just raise your hand and I can give you the mic if you want to ask one of the panelists or multiple.
Hello. My question is for Damien and Chloe. I guess I was wondering, because both of you guys in both of your works want to continuously talk about the conversation that you're having with the audience, the conversation that comes up with the work. I guess what came up for me is, like, with all of the works that you guys have made, what has been, I don't know, the conversation about the work that stuck with you the most, or the conversation about each, whether it's like a section of the piece, whether it's like the phrasing, whether it's even like the location that it's in, like what has been a conversation about the work that is like really stuck with you?
I can start, because I do have one top of mind, because this happens a lot. It's a conversation I have often, but it's a conversation that continues to be interesting to me, which is because these are public projects that have large-scale elements but also have small-scale elements. There's always someone who's like, but what if I missed part of it? Or like, what if somebody didn't see it all? And I'm like, well, what if they didn't? And then they're always like, what? Wouldn't you be upset? And I'm like, no, I would not be upset. And then they're like, oh, why? Right? And then we start to have an interesting conversation. And those conversations have turned into like discussions about what it means to discover something. It's turned into conversations about the nature of participation in everyday life and how we are rewarded by coming closer to things, but we don't always feel that we're going to be rewarded by coming closer to things. So like, how do we deal with that as emotional beings in the world? It talks about then, like, usually they want to talk about what they noticed, their specific thing that they're like, I thought I was the only person who saw that, or the only person who noticed that, or I felt like that was there just for me, right? And we wind up learning a lot about each other, not through a process of like completionism, but through a process of ongoing discovery. And I think that ultimately those conversations have a lot of power well beyond the artistic realm, where you start to do that in other arenas of your life as well, which I think is only good.
Yeah, I think this idea of the work going beyond itself is really important. And to answer the question of the person that I do not know and was not my student at Purchase College, like, I don't know if I can point to like a specific conversation, but there were several conversations during the ribbon cutting unveiling of that piece, which I think had a lot to do with the timing, just this idea of like hopefulness. Because again, like, for a decade, people have not been able to literally just like cross the street to this other part of town. And the bridge where my piece is at, there's a grocery store less than a block away from where the bridge lets out. So I just remember being there thinking, wow, like, for 10 years, this grocery store that you should have been able to walk to, like, in less than 10 minutes, you had to get into a car and like drive around. So how does that even just impact people's ability to like get food, let alone like have the fire department come when your house is on fire? But yeah, no, mostly just like kind of hopeful stuff. I did have a question for you too, but we can get to that if there's time.
I want to add to both of your good points. When I think it was Chloe, when you mentioned when you deliver a project, the project went on to live its own public life, and that's very real in our environment, which is often all the time very challenging. When it becomes an artwork that live a life that has a sense of permanence, it's facing all the foreseeable adversities that comes from nature and man-made elements. So for that, I think as a public art administrators, we are trying to do our due diligence to make sure that they live as long as we want them to be, and that's why oftentimes our job is not easy, especially I'm looking at Cheryl and Alex here, like the amount of effort and knowledge, skills that you guys put in to make sure that they live a good life is actually very, very daunting and really deserve the thanks from everybody. Yeah.
Okay, looked like over here there's a question.
Hi. I was going to draw a point of, or make an observation that I think is interesting that Chloe, you brought the Studio Museum project up. And it's interesting and notable, McClain, that in the Flight into Egypt show, you and Akili made a point of bringing the museum, or like thinking about the museum extending itself out into a community with the MTA projects. And of course, Studio Museum is doing a similar thing and moving work out into the world. And I guess I was just wondering if maybe you could say like five words about that thought process and organizing the exhibition, because of course for us at MTA, it's like a big deal to have been, you know, drawing the work into the institution, and what that sort of like means for our work and how that, you know, resonates with the community writ large here in New York.
Yeah, absolutely. It's more than 5 words, but I'll try to be brief. A couple thoughts. The specific artists that did these public projects were significant in that they were thinking about ancient Egypt beyond those singular installations that I brought up. And Akili and I, in the exhibition, are trying to push boundaries in a lot of ways. The exhibition doesn't just bring in artworks by well-known artists. There are works by a Met security officer. We're expanding definitions or labels here, which are not super productive necessarily, and it's important to be doing that within a museum, especially like the Met, that I would consider a bit more traditional. In terms of looking to the MTA or public artworks, it's essential because the point is that this is everywhere. This is happening outside of museums. Also, the importance of access and community. And Akili had been thinking about this show since he was a kid, and that started in Brooklyn, looking at murals and public artworks, not necessarily commissioned by the MTA at the time, but what he walked by on the street. And some of those are in the exhibition, images of them, because the murals no longer exist, but public art is extremely important, and if people don't even come to see the show, but they walk by some of these works, theirs, and the ones that we designated as part of the show, that's meaningful.
Well, I think that's about all we have time for now. I want to really thank all 4 of the presenters for tonight. And I feel like we just only scratched the surface, but want to, stay mindful with time. Can you join me in thanking our presenters? And just a final plug to please come back to the museum, especially if you haven't been here before. You can see the whole thing and all our vintage trains downstairs. And we'd love to see you at an upcoming program. Please become a member. Please donate. And thank you so much for coming.